Well, greetings once again. Welcome to another episode of our Tuesday Bible study here at Reformation OPC. Thanks for tuning in. It's been a couple of months since we've actually gotten together in this way, and my apologies for that. We knew that there would be a little bit of an interruption as we were resetting several things, but had no idea that it was going to last quite this long. So over the last several months, we've thought about reconfiguring this particular series of Bible studies, doing some different things with it, partly because of a reconfiguration in our Sunday school program, the opportunity to do more Q&As in other classes and venues. We wanted to see how we might be able to use this time, maybe in other ways, and perhaps it would be more effective. We've done some surveys and tried to get some feedback from those of you that are regular listeners and viewers of the program, and that actually ended up taking us a little bit of a different direction than what I had originally planned to pursue. So the plan moving forward is to use generally pre-recorded episodes like this one. They will still premiere live on Tuesday mornings at the usual time. Viewers can watch it live during that premiere or at any later time on YouTube or sermon audio just as before. We will still do some Q&A, and you'll see 1 or 2 episodes every month that are devoted to that. But on the alternate weeks, we will have more thematic studies, as those have seemed to be some of the most useful and popular of the episodes that we've had over the last year and a half. We're also going to begin introducing some literature, and what I mean by that is reading selected portions or short works, usually of Christian literature, that I have found helpful in my spiritual life and that I have often shared with other members of our church or people that I'm counseling as a pastor. Different works that I think can be very valuable in helping us think through certain themes. And that's actually what I want to do today. Today I want to share with you what I think is my favorite essay. It is written by Katherine Paterson, who is a well-known children's author. I'll tell you a little bit about her in just a minute. I enjoy essays very much, and I read them throughout the year. Probably my favorite essayist of all time would be G.K. Chesterton. Those of you who know me well know that I'm constantly reading something by Chesterton, often several things by Chesterton, just throughout the year. But this essay by Katherine Paterson, as I encountered it several years ago, really captured my heart and truly has become one of my most beloved essays of all time. I couldn't tell you how many times I've read it, probably dozens of times. And frequently on Sunday afternoons, as people gather at our house for lunch, we have certain regular visitors at our house every week that come, and other people who might be visiting our church or members of our church who kind of rotate through on a week-to-week basis. As people come to our church and we enjoy a meal after morning worship, it's pretty common that I will begin pulling out different things that I've read and maybe sharing some of those with the people who are there. Now, normally it's not quite as awkward as it might sound. Usually we're talking about something and there is something written by C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton or maybe something even outside of what we would typically identify as Christian literature, but that speaks to that issue. Inevitably, though, as those books get pulled out, we begin to read aloud, and discuss those ideas. Well, this essay by Katherine Paterson has been read at my house after Sunday lunch many times. My children have heard me read it so often that maybe they could begin reciting portions of it, and that would be okay with me. I truly do love this essay. Now, Katherine Paterson is a very acclaimed children's book author. She won the National Book Award for children's books twice. She won the Newbery Medal twice. I think she was received like an honorable mention in that Newbery Award program at least one other time. She's probably best known for Bridge to Terabithia. She's written books like Jacob Have I Loved and The Great Gilly Hopkins. Her most popular works are realistic fiction, for children and about children. And I want to say a couple of words about that before I get into the essay. I've never met Katherine Paterson. That would be amazing. I would love to do that. I would love to share a cup of coffee and pick her brain about a number of things. She writes books for children that actually are not my favorite types of books for children. This genre of realistic fiction introduces children and their lives and their experiences as if children are small adults. In other words, the literature will deal with very difficult themes, sometimes very dark themes. It might include some crude or even profane language. They're not necessarily the kind of books that I want to give to really young children. Now, that's not to say that these books are necessarily misrepresenting the experience of children. And I think this is one of the many valuable aspects of Katherine Paterson's work, is that she does give us a window into the real difficulties of children in painful circumstances in a fallen world. Bridge to Terabithia deals with the death of a child and the way that impacts that child's best friend and the families in their immediate circle. The great Gilly Hopkins deals with the trauma of being a foster child who is basically discarded by a parent and kicked from house to house and place to place and really unwanted and unloved, and then finding a place where you are loved and then losing that place. It's a difficult book. And so I'm not suggesting that in any way that these books are not dealing with important themes. I'm not trying to be critical. But interestingly, I'm gonna suggest from Mrs. Patterson's own essay that maybe there's a different literary approach for dealing with those kinds of themes. Regardless, I'm not necessarily today advocating that you go out and buy a bunch of Katherine Paterson books and you give them to your children. No, read carefully, read critically. Parents would want to pre-read those books and maybe decide when their children are ready to encounter some of those stories, some of those themes, some of that language. But her books aside, Katherine Paterson has written a number of essays and has delivered a number of talks that were published as essays. In fact, there are several books collecting these works that are nonfiction books about fiction. In other words, these are collections of essays and speeches that Mrs. Patterson has given over the years about writing fiction and writing for children and important aspects of that work. So there is this book that I'm going to be reading out of today, Gates of Excellence, that has long been out of print. I have purchased this many times. Every time I find a good price on a clean copy of this, I buy them up because I give them away frequently. They can sometimes be hard to find, but you can find them on some out-of-print dealers still, and even on Amazon periodically. Gates of Excellence is the collection I'm going to be reading from today. There was a second volume called The Spying Heart. And then there was a collection of those two collections. In other words, they took those two books after they went out of print and published them together in kind of an omnibus format called A Sense of Wonder. And I think there is another volume that I have not read called The Invisible Child that has also been published. All of these are out of print now, and so may be difficult to find. The essay that I'm going to be reading today is called Yes, But Is It True? First published in Gates of Excellence, and then later published in the collection of essays called A Sense of Wonder. And I don't know what the specific historical circumstances were for writing this particular essay, but this essay discusses the historical circumstances behind the writing of Bridge to Terabithia. And we'll talk some about that today. Now, one other thing I need to say about the kinds of books that Katherine Paterson has written for children, this realistic fiction for children, those who may be interested in exploring that idea and maybe critiquing that idea a little bit would benefit from Neil Postman's book, The Disappearance of Childhood. Neil Postman is another author that I may talk about at some point on one of these episodes. He has really captured my attention over the last couple of years. I'm very thankful for a friend who strongly urged me to read one of his books, and once I'd read that book, I just began plowing through a number of Postman's books and have greatly profited from that exercise, having read, 4 or 5 works of his now. His book, The Disappearance of Childhood, it critiques this genre of realistic children's fiction. Now, he does not address Katherine Paterson. He mentions Judy Blume a couple of times, but the critique would be on point with regard to some of the books that Mrs. Patterson has written. And by the way, just at the risk of offering too many disclaimers here at the beginning of our time together, Neil Postman is not writing as a Christian. He is a secular Jew, and so is not writing from the standpoint of a believer in Christ. And so just be warned about that. That's not to say that there is objectionable content in his book per se, but you will note several times in his discussion of these themes that he is not necessarily in the same place in terms of moral values or ethics as an Orthodox Christian might be. At the same time, his critique is very insightful, very helpful, and I think there is much to commend in it. Now, Katherine Paterson's work is important, it's valuable, but her essay is especially what I want to commend to you today. And I will say that this essay has been transcribed and posted online. I found it there a year or two ago trying to share this essay with other people. And as I read through the transcription, I found that there were a number of errors in it. And so it's not to say, I'm not going to link to that transcript. You can find it if you Google it, I'm sure. It's not to say that, it's probably substantially correct. And so maybe you would benefit from that. But unfortunately, I'm not aware of anywhere online that this essay in its entirety, in its correct form, is posted or published. And so the best thing to do would be to find a copy, an out-of-print copy of Gates of Excellence or A Sense of Wonder, or you can email me and I can send you a scanned copy of just that one essay. Now let me tell you a little bit about Katherine Paterson, and I was looking at several different bios of her. I've gotten familiar with her life story over the last couple of years as I've just been fascinated with her work. And actually, there's a very short bio in the back of Gates of Excellence that is a pretty good introduction. And so I'm going to read that and then maybe tell you a few other things. In the About the Author section to this work, it says, Katherine Paterson's works have received wide acclaim and been published in many languages. Among her books are Park's Quest, Come Sing Jimmy Joe, an ALA notable children's book, Rebels of the Heavenly Kingdom, and Gates of Excellence. Also, Jacob Have I Loved and Bridge to Terabithia, winners of the 1981 and 1978 Newbery Medals. The Great Gilly Hopkins, a Newbery Honor Book and winner of the 1979 National Book Award. And The Master Puppeteer, which received the 1977 National Book Award. Katherine Paterson, the daughter of missionaries, was born in China and spent her early childhood there. Educated in both China and the United States, she was graduated from King College in Bristol, Tennessee, and later received master's degrees from the Presbyterian School of Christian Education in Richmond, Virginia, and Union Theological Seminary in New York. Parents of 4 children, Mrs. Patterson and her husband live in Barr, Vermont. Now, this, of course, was published a number of years ago. Mrs. Patterson's husband has since died. She is still living, at least as of the time of this recording. She was born to Presbyterian missionaries in China, and from what I've read, Chinese was her first language. Her family fled China in 1937 at the onset of World War II. Her father was a Presbyterian pastor who himself had fought in World War I, had been gassed, and from the historical records I've seen, actually lost part of his leg and had some lung problems throughout his life, but continued to serve as a Presbyterian pastor in the mainline church during the time after the family returned from the mission field. He planted and pastored churches in the eastern United States. And then Katherine Paterson, as she grew up and became an adult, she actually served as a missionary in Japan for a number of years. And that influenced some of her early writing, which relates to Japan and to Japanese culture. She later married a mainline Presbyterian pastor with whom she had her 4 children and 7 grandchildren. And she just, again, never met her. Seems like a delightful person. We might disagree on a number of things theologically, but nonetheless, I'm thankful for those things that we would share in common. Now, what I want to do is read this essay in its entirety. It's not super lengthy, but it's worth reading in its entirety. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to go back through it and draw your attention to several points before offering maybe some takeaway lessons, observations. So again, the essay is entitled, Yes, But Is It True? By Katherine Paterson. A friend sent me recently a Miss Peach cartoon strip. At the left is a huge hand-lettered sign that says, Arthur answers the eternal questions, with a large arrow pointing toward Arthur, who is being questioned by a pony-tailed seeker of wisdom. Arthur, she asks, is there anything worthwhile in life but truth and beauty? Yes, he replies, there is love, also Chinese food. I do not need to tell you that the reason my friend sent me this cartoon is unrelated to my devotion to truth, beauty, and love. I am, in fact, distinctly uncomfortable in the face of eternal questions. Yet there is one eternal question which I, as a writer of fiction for children and young people, am often asked by children and never asked by adults. Is it true? The child asks. Is your story true? Ha, you say. We adults don't ask that question because we know you write fiction. And fiction, quote, is the act of feigning or imagining that which does not exist or is not actual, end quote. Ergo, fiction, by definition, is not true. I'm being unfair. Some of you are wiser than that, and although you may never voice the question to the writer, you will come to one of my novels, or to anyone's novel, with that same question. Is it true? And my answer for you is the same answer that I give the child who asks. I hope so. I meant for it to be true. I tried hard to make it so. I am a graduate of a small Presbyterian college. We had a college president who was a brilliant man full of aphorisms for every occasion. One of Dr. Liston's aphorisms has stuck with me through the years. It is this: when the Greeks decided to get practical, they began running restaurants and shining shoes. By which I think he meant that civilization, as well as education, takes a downward spiral when it ceases to ask what is truth and concerns itself primarily with what is measurable. In the beginning of all things was God, and in the beginning of human consciousness was the story. In an address to the Royal Society of Literature, Kipling once said that, quote, fiction is truth's elder sister. Obviously, no one in the world knew what truth was till someone had told a story, end quote. For proof of what Kipling says, we need only to look at our own biblical heritage and find that in the beginning there was the story. Perhaps the more orthodox among us would hesitate to say that it was the story that shaped the truth. But surely it has been the vehicle for the truth for as long as the human race can remember. And such a delightful vehicle. It is almost a truism that the most exciting words in the English language are, once upon a time. But for those of you who are suspicious of delight, let me remind you of the practical value of the story. Bruno Bettelheim, in his book, The Uses of Enchantment, advances the idea, which, though not original with him, is one that he, as a psychiatrist, eloquently champions, that the child who hears fairy tales is able to face the dark and wild side of his or her own nature, and to comprehend on an unconscious level the incomprehensible adult world. Moreover, the fairy tale gives the child hope that he will succeed, overcoming the giants within and without, that he will live happily ever after. Bettelheim does not feel that other kinds of stories have the same elemental power as the traditional fairy tale. This is a point I would want to argue. But the inarguable point is that stories will not have any power if they are never heard or read. Which brings me back to a concern about education. Why, in places of higher learning, is the reading of fiction considered some kind of aberration? A recent issue of Psychology Today told about a student at Princeton University who finally transferred. He felt he was socially ostracized at Princeton because in his free time he would read novels. You mustn't embarrass college students, much less college graduates, by asking them what novels they have read in the past year. And yet, for those who are seeking truth, which is nearer the truth? Stone and Church's statistically factual description of the average adolescent girl, or Tolstoy's picture of Natasha at the ball? Fiction allows us to do something that nothing else quite does. It allows us to enter fully into the lives of other human beings. But, you may argue, these are not real people. They are fictitious, merely the figments of one writer's imagination. At this point, the other side of the brain takes over. There is nothing mere about Natasha. We know with what Walter de la Mare calls that compelling inward ring that Natasha is true. She is more real to us than the people we live with every day because we have been allowed to eavesdrop on her soul. A great novel is a kind of conversion experience. We come away from it changed. And just as a season with Natasha and Andre and Pierre may make us wiser and more compassionate people, a season with Heathcliff or Jude Fawley has the power to shake us at the roots. The fake characters we read about will evaporate like the morning dew, but the real ones, the true ones, will haunt us for the rest of our days. We Christians have done a lot of preaching about sin, much of it incomprehensible, and much of it doing nothing except laying on guilt and despair. Part of this is, I believe, because rational argument rarely convinces sinners and never saves them. But the other part is that everybody talking about hell ain't a been there, to paraphrase the spiritual. Unlike our Lord, we have not been able or willing to descend into hell. So our words of grace seep out bland and bloodless. Perhaps this is why the tax collectors and harlots are closer to the kingdom of heaven than we. But those of us who have followed Frodo on his quest have had a vision of the true darkness. We know that we, like him, would have never gotten up the steep slope of Mount Doom had the faithful Sam not flung us on his back and carried us up, crawling at the last. We know, too, that we would never have parted with the baneful ring of power had not the piteous Gollum torn it from our bleeding finger and, in the effort, fallen screeching into the abyss, clutching his damned treasure and ours. When we read fiction that is true, we do not say, "There but for the grace of God go I." Rather, "Here I am." For in such writing we recognize our naked selves with a shudder or a laugh, sometimes quite wonderfully with both. Over 20 years ago, a college English professor said something that has bothered me ever since. He wondered aloud if it was possible to describe Christian experience effectively except by fantasy or science fiction. I've tried to fight this view, because I don't write fantasy or science fiction. But he may be right. I say this as one haunted by visions of the great lion Aslan, whose bright goodness never fails to flood my spirit with awe and joy. I was once very much involved with a young man who, when I tried to share with him my love for C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, said earnestly that he felt it was wrong of Lewis to distort the Bible in this way. I should have known at that moment that the relationship was doomed. Aslan is not a distortion, but a powerful symbol of the Lion of Judah, which can nourish our spirits as the reasoned arguments of 1,000 books of theology can never do. We can dare face the dark because we've had a shining glimpse of the light. If fiction is true for the reader of it, what about the writer? Is he or she out there laughing at those of us who have become so bewitched by the mere arrangement of words upon a page? I read recently that after Hardy had finished Jude the Obscure, he never wrote another novel. He turned instead to writing poetry, so appalled, we may guess, by the vision of darkness he had created, that he dared not go deeper into it himself. So it can be a dangerous business. A friend of mine who writes history books said to me that he thought that the two creatures most to be pitied were the spider and the novelist, their lives hanging by a thread spun out of their own guts. But in some way, I think writers of fiction are the creatures most to be envied, because who else besides the spider is allowed to take that fragile thread and weave it into a pattern? What a gift of grace to be able to take the chaos from within and from it to create some semblance of order. I only know one writer really well, and since she is the one making these observations, I must, before I am through, apply what I have been saying to her. I can't tell you exactly when the story began, somewhere among the catacombs of childhood's fears, but it began to grow in the early months of 1974 along with a tumor, which, after a lifetime of blooming health, invaded my body. The cancer was removed, the prognosis hopeful, but by that time I had heard the bell toll. I could no longer pretend to be immortal. Before either I or my family had had time to recuperate from my illness, our David's closest friend, a winsome, humorous little girl of 8, was struck and killed by lightning. The two events were almost more than we could bear. Every time John or I left town, the children were sure we'd never return. I was known to wonder myself. David went through all the classical stages of grief and invented a few, including one in which he was sure that God was punishing him by killing off his loved ones one by one. He had even worked out the order of demise. I was second on the list, right after his younger sister. In the middle of all this, I went to one of the regular monthly meetings of the Children's Book Guild in Washington. By some fluke, I was seated at the head table with the guest speaker, who was Ann Durrell, the editor for children's books at Dutton. During the polite amenities at the beginning of the meal, one of my fellow guild members said innocently, "How are the children?" To which, as you all know, the answer is, "Fine." I muffed it. I began to really tell how the children were, which led me and my rather startled dinner mates into the long tale of David's grief. When I finally shut up, the guest of honor said quietly, "I know this sounds just like an editor, but you ought to write that story." I thought I couldn't. The rule is, as you may know, that a writer should wait 15 years before writing about an incident of personal history. It hadn't been 5 months, but I began to try. It became a way of dealing with my inability to comfort my child. After many false starts, I began to write a story in pencil in a used spiral notebook so that if it came to nothing, I could pretend that I'd never been very serious about it. Gradually, I was encouraged by the emergence of 32 smudged pages to transfer from the tentative pencil to the typewriter, and the book moved forward, gathering momentum, only to become absolutely frozen. I found I couldn't let my fictional child die. I wrote around the death. I even cleaned the kitchen. Anything to prevent this death from taking place. Finally, I confessed to a close friend of mine what was happening. "I guess I can't go through Lisa's death again," I concluded. She looked at me straight in the eye. "I don't think it's Lisa's death you can't face, Katherine. I think it's yours." Speaking of that compelling inward ring, I went back to my study and closed the door. If it was Lisa's death I couldn't face, that was one thing. But if it was mine, by God, I would face it. I finished the chapter, and within a few weeks the draft, with cold sweat rolling down my arms. And I did what no professional writer would ever do. I mailed it off to my editor before the sweat had evaporated. I wish for every writer in the world an editor like Virginia Buckley. She did not brush aside that fragile thread spun from my guts. "I laughed through the first 2/3, she told me, "and cried through the last." So it was all right. She understood, as she always has, what I was trying to do. But a thread is not a story. And in children's novels, we still expect a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this is what Virginia gently prodded me into weaving. I love revisions. Where else in life can spilled milk be transformed into ice cream? We can't go back and revise our lives, but being allowed to go back and revise what we have written comes closest. By now I had some distance from the book. My heart had stopped pounding, my palms were dry, my head cool, my eye cooler. I was far enough away from the facts to see the truth from which they sprang. I was now ready to write fiction. If the early drafts had been conceived in fear and grief, this revision was born in joy. In the mere rearrangement of words upon a page, I had passed through a valley of the shadow and come out singing. In fact, when I sent Virginia the revision, I wrote her that I was sure love was blind, for I had just mailed her a flawless manuscript. My vision, you'll be glad to know, has since been restored. I no longer believe that Bridge to Terabithia is without flaws. But to this day, when a child asks me if it is true, I answer, trying not to tremble too conspicuously, "Oh, I hope so." On 95, just before the Delaware line, there is a road sign I invariably look for. In the nearly 14 years I've traveled that road, this one sign has been the high point of an otherwise monotonous superhighway. The sign reads, "Northeast Rising Sun." For years I had a fantasy that I would simply turn off the thruway at that point and drive until I found that Shangri-La, that Brigadoon of Maryland, named by an ancient poet, Northeast Rising Sun. Then one day, as I was smiling at my sign, a horrible thought struck. Suppose there was no such place. Suppose there was no village nestled in the eastern hills answering to that wonderful name. I didn't want to know, but that ubiquitous left side of my brain decided to ferret out the truth. I heard myself asking my husband, quite against my will, if it was possible that Northeast Rising Sun was not actually the name of a town. He was driving, and entirely missed the quavering tone, replying very matter-of-factly that he thought it wasn't. Again, I let it lie. After all, husbands aren't always right, even mine. But the demon of brutal realism refused to give up. It drove me at last to a large map of the state and forced me to look in the northeast corner. Alas, as I had suspected, but was so long loath to acknowledge, there is no such place on the map as Northeast Rising Sun. There are, rather, two towns, Northeast on the east side of 95 and Rising Sun on the west. My poetic signboard was a fiction. And fiction, though it may be true, is not the truth, any more than a signpost is a place. But it can be a signpost. Fiction is not the gospel, but it can be a voice crying in the wilderness. And for the writer and the reader who know grace, it will not be a cry of despair, but a cry of hope, a voice crying in our wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Well, now, hopefully, you can tell why I love that essay. I mean, if you know me at all, you know that I love fiction. I love literature. I love books of all kinds. I love good, substantive, true fiction. And I think Katherine Paterson has done us a wonderful service in connecting that love for true fiction with our love for truth that we find as Christians in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we could talk for hours, literally, about this essay. I don't want to do that here today, but I do want to just kind of walk back through that essay and draw your attention to a few points that I hope stood out as I was reading it with you and that perhaps you will find useful to meditate upon. At the beginning of the essay, she says, I am asked this question by children, but never by adults. Is it true? Is your story true? And then she kind of pokes a little bit of fun at her adult listeners and readers and says, well, adults don't ask that because we know that you write fiction and we know that fiction is not true. And then she concedes, of course, some of you are wiser than that. But really, the play there with her readers works because it is true of many adults and maybe many serious Christians. We just don't see much value in fiction. We read important books. Like right now, I'm surrounded by important books, and they are important books. They're wonderful books. I love them. I find my soul helped, my mind taught, my life enriched. And yet, what I'm surrounded by here in this part of my library is not fiction, but are books of theology and books of history and books of sermons and historical documents. Those kinds of things are very valuable and important, and maybe we feel like we should spend all of our time there. But if you think that fiction is not true because it's not nonfiction, you really are missing the point. And hopefully this essay will help you understand the point. The distinction between something that is true and something that is the truth is very, very important. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The Bible, as the Word of God, is objectively, universally, infallibly the truth. And yet, when we're thinking about good literature and we're thinking about true fiction, we're thinking about literature and stories that point us to that greater truth. They point beyond, it points beyond itself, and it echoes those themes that we find in the person of God and in His self-revelation. And still in the early part of the essay, she refers to one of the things that Dr. Liston, her college professor, used to say, that when the Greeks decided to get practical, they began running restaurants and shining shoes. She says, by which I think he meant that civilization, as well as education, takes a downward spiral when it ceases to ask what is truth and concerns itself primarily with what is measurable. Now, I've heard people say that question, what is truth, is itself a bad question. It certainly can be asked in a bad way. We think about the way that Pilate asked that question in John chapter 18 as Christ is standing before him and he says, what is truth? But he asks that in kind of a scoffing, derisive manner, a dismissive manner. He's rejecting the truth that Christ is making known to him. And obviously that would be a bad question. It's not even a real question. But the question, what is truth, is the fundamental question that all human beings have to wrestle with. What is the truth? What is the truth about me, about my life, about this world, about where I came from, about why I'm here, about where I'm going, about how I ought to live? What is the truth that should guide me in this life? And when a civilization or when a household or an individual stops asking that kind of question, stops wrestling that kind of question, and is simply concerned with the practicality of getting through the day, well, things are going to go downhill from there. And unfortunately, I think that is where we're at in so many ways. We're concerned, we've got our faces stuck to our smartphones all the time. We're just concerned with what is right in front of us. We're just surviving through each day. We're just distracting ourselves to death rather than kind of disconnecting from what is immediately in front of us and thinking in a contemplative way about these broader themes and the larger world and the God who made us in His image for Himself, things of that nature. She cites Kipling's speech in front of the Royal Society of Literature about the relationship between story and truth. And then she connects that with the Bible. She says we need only look to our own biblical heritage to find that in the beginning there was the story. And she's not saying what some might say, and that is that the Bible is simply a work of fiction. But what she's saying is that God communicated Himself, He revealed Himself and His truth through stories, through interactions. Much of the Bible is just narrative. Now, I take it to be absolutely historical in its nature, that this is not historical fiction. This is actual history. These are real things that happen. I believe in a historical Adam and Eve. I believe in an actual global flood where Noah and his family survived on an ark that God directed him to build, that God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt by mighty signs and wonders and the 10 plagues, and He led them through the wilderness by Moses. All of these things really happened. But the point is, God is revealing Himself not in a systematic theology or in a textbook of some kind. He's revealing himself in the experience of life. He's revealing himself through the experience of these characters, and then he's revealing himself to us by writing down their stories and communicating himself to us through his interactions with them. She talks a little bit about the political incorrectness, maybe, as she's writing this, of college students reading novels that would be, maybe embarrassing, would seem to discredit them in some way. And I've known some pretty serious Reformed Christians like that. They would never imagine reading a novel that they would be very dismissive and critical of. Appreciating C.S. Lewis, for example, think that it is speculative and just not worthy of our time or attention. Might be very critical of someone like me, a Presbyterian pastor, loving G.K. Chesterton, who of course went to the Roman Catholic Church after beginning his life as an Anglican, and so you get that idea of if pastors are getting together, and I do this periodically, we'll sit down and we'll say, what have you been reading lately that might be helpful? This is a question I ask pastors all the time. But I know that it's always going to be some kind of work of theology, some kind of work of history, some kind of work of sociology or philosophy. And I'm interested in those kind of books, but I don't think I've ever asked that question and had someone give me the name of a novel. Maybe it's happened with one or two of my friends, but it's pretty unusual. One of the key ideas in this essay that you need to take away is what she says here. Fiction allows us to do something that nothing else quite does. It allows us to enter fully into the lives of other human beings. This is something that even historical narrative doesn't do. Historical narrative may tell us what happened in a person's life, but in fiction, we are, as she says, eavesdropping on their soul. We're actually in their head. We're in their heart. And this is the difference between reading a great story and watching a movie. I'm not against watching movies. I don't watch a lot of movies. Our family doesn't have television, but we'll stream some things, some videos, and we'll have family movie night once a week. But I don't watch TV, and I don't watch a lot of movies, and I'm not current on a lot of that. But I'm not opposed to watching great films. But the difference that you need to see is that when you're watching a movie, you are observing something happening. And when you're reading a book, it's happening to you. There is a difference. Now, you can argue that there's value in both types of media. But when you're watching a movie, you are on the edge of your seat because you're observing something happening. But when you're reading a book, you're not observing, you're experiencing. Fiction draws us into an experience, and that's how it communicates to us. And that's why fiction is unique in the way that it is able to communicate true ideas to us. She says, those of us who have followed Frodo on his quest have had a vision of the true darkness. Many of you know that I have a pretty robust list of books that I reread every single year. The Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, every year. The Chronicles of Narnia, every year. C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, every year. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, every year. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, every year. Why is that? Well, Orthodoxy, set that aside for a second. That's not really fiction. Although, like this essay, it helps us learn how to read fiction. But the Pilgrim's Progress, the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lord of the Rings are stories that really connect truth and life. They take the great truths of the Bible. They take the great truths of beauty and goodness, the things that we learn about God and from God, and they connect us to those ideas in this lived experience that we're reading about, that we're seeing unfold. And they're helpful analogies. Of course, the Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory. I'll have more to say about that in just a second. The Lord of the Rings, the Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien and Lewis denied that they should be interpreted in an allegorical manner. Fine insofar as it goes. There's no doubt whatsoever that they are analogies. They are illustrations. They are applications of these ideas. And you can't read those stories and not see that. And the more you read those stories, I would hope the more clearly, the more deeply, the more pervasively you will see how true that is. Fiction connects with our lives. Fiction allows us to live inside the heads and hearts of different people and to experience things that we never otherwise would, to experience the joys and the sorrows, the struggles and the successes, and not just in an escapist way. Some people read fiction for that purpose. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't think that's what Mrs. Patterson is talking about in this essay either. There may be some entertainment value in sort of escapist fiction. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about recognizing that just like Christian, we all are journeying, we all who are Christians are journeying from the city of destruction to the celestial city, and that we encounter many dangers and difficulties along the road, and that His experience is our experience. We all who are Christians recognize that we are, like the Pevensey children, drawn out of the world and given a glimpse of the glory of another world, where we meet the King and are sanctified and equipped and taught, prepared for the work that He has called us to do, the mission that He has sent us upon, and that the whole time our ambition, our desire, our heart's longing is to be in Aslan's country and to never be sent home again. Again, we who are Christians are like the company who is taking this ring of power on this quest and ultimately seeking to destroy the power of the enemy, to see the power of the enemy broken, to see it fall, and are recognizing that though we would have never chosen to live in such a time or chosen such work for ourselves, here we are. And this is what providence has appointed for us. And the question is not, is this what we want to do, but rather, how ought I to be faithful where I am? We could talk about this again for hours and hours and hours, but these stories connect to the lives that God has appointed for us. In fact, God is the great author, and He is the great storyteller, and He made us in His image. We are living out the story right now. Right now. I mean, what does the Bible say? Psalm 139. All the days of my life were written in a book before the first day began. They were written in a book before God. In Revelation chapter 20, books are opened. The books with the record of our lives. But that book was written before I was born. We're living out the story that God Himself is telling. He sang the world into existence, and He's singing still. And as He sings, the ballad is unfolding. We are part of this great, grand epic. And we need to see that. And you won't see that if you're living your life on social media. You won't see that if you're living your life watching television or even playing video games. You have to see that by encountering stories. And I know immediately somebody's going to email me or text me and say, oh, but so many video games are stories. Yes, I'm sure that that's true. I don't play enough video games to know how true that may or may not be. Okay, I'll simply take your word for it. Yes, there may be television or film or video games that also tell stories. That's because human beings are storytellers. But what I want to suggest to you is that 200 years from now, people are still going to be reading The Pilgrim's Progress. They're still going to be reading The Lord of the Rings. They're still going to be reading the Chronicles of Narnia. They're not still going to be playing whatever video game you're playing. They're not going to be watching probably the movies that you're spending most of your time watching. There is a difference, and there is a substance, and there is a transcendence to great literature that points us to these great themes. Now, maybe the most important part of the essay is actually the concluding paragraph. Let me read that again. Fiction, though it may be true, is not the truth any more than a signpost is a place, but it can be a signpost. Fiction is not the gospel, but it can be a voice crying in the wilderness. And for the writer and the reader who know grace, it will not be a cry of despair, but a cry of hope, a voice crying in our wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. What's very important is that we not lose sight of the difference between the Chronicles of Narnia and the Bible, the Lord of the Rings, and the Holy Scriptures. These are not the same things. The Bible is the truth. Jesus says, John 17, your word is truth. And these works of literature that we're talking about are true. They're true insofar as they point us to Christ. This is what all true stories do. And it doesn't matter if it is Greek mythology that was originally oral stories told in cities and amphitheaters and then were written down. It doesn't matter if it's literature written by Christians or non-Christians. Not even a pagan can tell a true story without a Christ character. All true stories prepare, anticipate, point toward, reflect in some way the gospel. All true stories do. In fact, this is one of the ways that you can tell a story that is true from a story that is not true. And maybe that's a theme that we could unpack in more detail at another time. True fiction is a sign pointing not to itself, but beyond itself, pointing us ultimately to the true storyteller, who is himself the way, the truth, and the life. Many Reformed Christians have no time for fiction. They only read important books. And I don't want to criticize, I don't want to shame in any way. I think that's unfortunate. I think that misunderstands some things that could be valuable and helpful. But if you find yourself in that boat and you feel like this episode is just kind of a waste of your time, well, I apologize that you've wasted your time. Enjoy the good books that you're reading. I'm glad that you read important things. Many Christians who do read fiction, I will say, read fiction that doesn't have a lot of substance to it. There's not a lot of value there. Maybe there is some value in entertainment, and I don't want to dismiss that entirely. There is a time and a place to eat birthday cake, but it's not every day. There's a time and a place to eat Oreos dipped in coffee. Those of you who've eaten Sunday lunch at our house know what I'm talking about. Everybody tries dipping an Oreo in coffee. And even if you don't like coffee or don't regularly eat Oreos, I think you will enjoy it. It's really, really good. But that's what we do on the Lord's Day, not on other days. Right? If you ate Oreos every day, well, your health would be greatly impaired. No, there's a time and a place for those kinds of sweets and fats, but it's not every day. The kind of fiction that a lot of people read is just like that. It's superficial, it's vapid. There may be some value in escaping for a little while to entertain yourself. How much better to escape in true fiction? In true stories that ultimately prepare your heart and point you more and more toward Jesus Christ. Fiction can communicate and connect themes in ways that nonfiction cannot do. It awakens our imagination, and as Mrs. Patterson says, it allows us to eavesdrop on a character's soul and to observe how the truth is impacting them. Charles Spurgeon reportedly read The Pilgrim's Progress more than 100 times in his lifetime. Now, I have books that I reread every year and have for quite a number of years. I haven't even gotten close to that with any single volume. I mean, can you just do the math on that? To read The Pilgrim's Progress 100 times, if you read it 5 times a year, you'd have to do that every year for 20 years. That's a lot. That's a lot of reading. But that book really spoke powerfully to Spurgeon and powerfully shaped him and his preaching and his worldview and was a blessing in his life. And we should have books like that. Now, not every work of fiction is worth reading, and is certainly not worth rereading. And even the ones that are worth rereading are not necessarily worth reading 100 times. Very, very few books would be worth reading that many times. But there is something to be said, I think, for having a few key books that accompany you in your life, that become yours, and that you are constantly living in. I know what those books are for me, and you may have a different set of books that are true for you. But there's something to be said for having those books that will carry you through life, accompany you through life, and that will continually teach you, refresh you, encourage you along the way. Now, first and foremost, the Bible is that book. It should be first and foremost in your reading. But I think when you find characters and stories that are true and that bring that truth close to home and help you relate it to your life, that can also be a valuable part of your day. God is the great author. He made us to love stories as image bearers. And as we said, the difference between true stories and those that are not true is that all true stories prepare us for Christ, point us to Christ, reflect in some way Christ. And I would encourage you, if you're not a lover of fiction and true fiction, if you've kind of dismissed the place for this kind of literature in your Christian life, pick up something like the Pilgrim's Progress. I know that people in our congregation have said sometimes it's hard to read. Well, some things that are worth doing are hard to do. Get a copy of the book and get an audio copy of the book and listen to it as you follow along. I'll tell you what makes Pilgrim's Progress easier to read is reading it multiple times. And that's true of any substantive book. Pick up the Chronicles of Narnia and read them. The C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy is tremendously helpful, and the third volume of that trilogy, That Hideous Strength, may be the most important work of fiction that Lewis ever wrote. It really is a work of fiction that is unpacking and applying what he discusses in The Abolition of Man. The Lord of the Rings, again, don't talk to me about the movies. The movies may be fine, they may be very entertaining and good, but if you haven't read the book, you don't know the whole story. And I think the best and maybe the most important part of the story actually is not in the movies. And the movies were written and produced in such a way as to preclude that one most important chapter in the entire trilogy. But you'd have to read the trilogy to know what that might be. Again, let me simply encourage you, not shame you, not guilt you, not tell you that you have to do this, but to commend to you true fiction as a valuable part of a spiritual life, to engage in spiritual reading and to think Christianly about it. And I am very, very thankful that a number of years ago I was introduced to this essay by Katherine Paterson. I hope that it will be a blessing and an encouragement to you, and that God will richly bless you throughout this day